The next vehicle is the Carro Armato M1441. This is a medium 14 short ton built in 1941, and there were 752 of them built. It had a crew of 4, commander, driver, machine gunner, slash radio man, and of course the loader, and the tank was developed from the first main Italian medium tank, the M1340. Now, the reason why I decided to cover this vehicle instead of the M1340 is because since it was the first in its line, there's tons of information on it. So, if people like this style of video, I'll go back and I'll make sure to have a look at that for you. And I definitely, there is an easily half an hour, video of information I can give you on the M13. On top of this, the tank itself, it had a fully traversing turret, which is, something which by that time had become standard. It had a high velocity 47mm, a coaxial 7.9mm, and also a twin Breda 7.9mm in the hull, and a 4th machine gun on a pintle on the turret, which could be removed. So the pintle on the turret, think about it very similarly to how you have like a 50 cal on the top of a lot of American tanks. That's pretty much the same thing when it comes to Italian tanks, but instead they had 7.9s. So what are the stats behind this 47mm? Well, it's called the Cannon DA 47/32, and it fired the AP L32 round. This thing had 58mm of pen at 100 meters, 43mm of pen at 500 meters, and it also had access to a heat shell, which penned 55mm at 90 degrees. The machine could also go 32 kilometers an hour, and as you can see, the pen on the gun isn't the best, but it still should be serviceable in War Thunder. When we compare it to its predecessors, it had much better armor, 42mm on the front and then 15mm everywhere else, and it also had a better engine. So it had the Fiat SPA 15T M41 V8 diesel, 145 horsepower, 10 horsepower per ton engine. This was seen as much more reliable than previous ones due to certain additions to it, such as the improvement of the radiator system and also improvement of the fuel system. But even though it was an improvement over the ones before it, when it actually came to how useful it was, let's just say it wasn't exactly a long-term solution. I've given you a bunch of stats there. The fact that it could pen 58mm at 100 meters, the fact that it has a bunch of 7.9s on it, the fact that its armor is only 42mm, and the fact that it could only go a max speed of 32 kilometers an hour. Well, this would be okay for a tank which was maybe 1937-38, at most. This was a 1941 vehicle. Think about the vehicles that are running around in 1941. This is not one of them that you see as the pinnacle. There was also the problem that by early 1943, it was replaced by the new M1542. And this actually coincided with the end of the production. So basically, when the last of the M1441s got off the production line, they immediately switched to M1542s because those the M14s were redundant once they came off the production line, which is very sad for them. And when we look at the M1441 in battle, the crew of these opinions were that they were unreliable, like a lot of the Italian vehicles, basically a lot of engine trouble, which is an issue. They were cramped inside, and also they caught fire a lot when hit, which is definitely not something that you want to hear, especially from a diesel. So, with all of these factors thrown in, let's just say it wasn't exactly the best medium tank out there. On top of this, the actual the M15, the improved statistics on it, it had 50mm of frontal armor, it had a higher velocity 47mm, it had pen 60 at 500 meters, and it used the same gun, but it used the AP L40 round, which penned 70mm at 100 and 50 to 60mm at 500. So as you can see, overall, it was quite a dramatic improvement when you compare its predecessor. But the reason why I wanted to talk about the M1441 instead of the M15 or the M13, or, sorry, not the M13, yes, sorry, yeah, the M13, is the fact that when we look at the M14 chassis, there's a lot of cool Semoventes built off of it. Now, if you don't know what a Semovente is, it basically means either self-propelled or automotive. So if you see a machine which is called a Semovente da 9053, then what that means is it's a self-propelled of 90 to 53, or the automotive of the 90 to 53. This basically means SPG in the grand scheme of things, and that's what we're looking at. So the Semovente da 9053, or as I said, the automotive of 9053. It's a 90mm with a 53 caliber long barrel. This is the one which may break rank 3 for the Italians. So there were 30 of them built in 1942. They had a crew of 4, commander, driver, and then 2 gunners/loaders, so whoever took it in turns. And the reason why they decided that they needed these was because they ran into, let's say, stiff opposition. The Riccio Esercito, who were part of the Eastern Offensive, you've got to remember, Italy actually went after the Soviet Union. They invaded along with the Germans, or at least in part. Let's just say they ran into a few issues with the Soviet tanks, and by a few issues, I mean a lot of issues. Their Italian tanks that they brought did not match up at all to the T-34s and the KV-1s that they were running into. So they needed a solution, and they needed it quick. So what they did was they had a look at some German vehicles for inspiration. And at the time of 1942, mid of 1942, the Germans had created something called the Hornets, or the Hornets. And this actually eventually became the Nashorn that we see in game. It was, obviously, it had the 88. It was the first, I believe, open casemate 88 tank destroyer. I might be wrong on that, but I believe that's true. And they took inspiration from it to create their own powerful SPG. So the gun was picked. It was a powerful anti-aircraft and naval gun, the 90mm Modelo 1939. And what is crazy about this machine, about the gun, is that it had a 19 RPM when fully efficient. So we're talking about around nearly every 3 seconds, which is quite impressive. It had 830 meters per second on the muzzle velocity, and it had a heat round that could penetrate 70 millimeters at 2,200 meters. So we're not talking about something that does a lot of pen, but I could only find the heat round. I couldn't find a HE round for this, or a AP round, and I've got a feeling that the AP round would put quite a large hole in something. It also, this gun was mounted on Lancia trucks in North Africa, but the reason why they needed to create the Semovente was that in Russia, it required a tracked vehicle because of the terrain. So they couldn't use these Lancia trucks to go around in. They would have to find a tracked vehicle. Obviously, the chassis that they picked was not exactly perfect, but one of the problems the Italians had throughout the war was an issue with available platforms for things. And therefore, because of this, they decided to pick the best of what they had. And the best of what they had was the M1441. And this is where the M14 comes back. So they picked it. Even though they picked it, it wasn't the perfect chassis, but they could make it work. It had issues with how to mount the gun. And what this meant was that this machine could only have 30 millimeters of armor, and they also lowered the back of the platform of the chassis in order to fit on the gun with the gun shield and also so it was easy for the loader and gunner to be able to get onto the gun. An interesting little tidbit that is always brought up by this when talking about this machine is that the machine itself could only carry 6 shells. And so this is because it was designed with the premise that it would be used in a defensive or an artillery position set of ways. It would never properly be on the front line, and that would mean that in order to restock it, it would be followed by a Fiat L640, which was modified to carry ammo. If you don't know what the Fiat L640 is, it's this little tank, let's call it. I mean, it's very close to a tankette. But what they did was they chopped off the turret on it and they opened it up so it could carry ammo. So every Semovente 9053 that you find, the idea would be there would be this ammo carrier behind it. On top of it, something that is kind of astounding about the 9053 is that they turned around this project really, really quickly. So they had something that they wanted to create. They created a prototype, and then after that, they created everything else really quickly. So the prototype was completed in March of 1942. Because of the prototype and its success, there was 30 of them that were ordered, and then 15 command vehicles on top of this. And what was, as I said, surprising, by the time that April had rolled around, and the end of April, the Semoventes were ready to go. So we're talking March, April. March, April. We're talking about a matter of weeks here, maybe 4 to 5 weeks, that these went from prototype stage to ready to go. Now, the problem with this, even though they were made incredibly fast, is the SPGs were actually shipped to North Africa instead of Russia. And the reason for this is because in the Russian campaign, it was already seen as lost, or at least going very, very badly. So, with that said, they decided to take them to North Africa because they saw it as a much better strategical use, and these actually performed well until the end of the Tunisia campaign, when they were taken back to Italy and eventually used by the Germans once the armistice came in. Some of the key factors, some people may ask, why didn't they put a revolving turret on it? Why did they decide to mount the gun in the center of the chassis? Or why didn't they put it in the center? The reason for not adding in the revolving turret, even though it would have been really nice, way too heavy. So therefore that was out of the picture. Why didn't they centrally mount this? Kind of like how you see the Waffenträger with the 88 on it, the long 88. The reason why they didn't do this is because if you mounted it in the center of the chassis, it was seen that the platform would not be stable enough. So it would rock. Well, it wouldn't rock, but there would be too much weight on either side, and therefore it won't be exactly a pleasant experience to either drive or to either, be at. The next vehicle we're going to look at is another tank destroyer. And by tank destroyer, I mean SPG. The Semovente da 7534. We have a self-propelled of the 7534 gun variety. There was 192 of these built between 1942 and 43. So the reason why this one carries on from the last vehicle is because it was another vehicle that was inspired by German design success. And in this case, for the 7534, it was because of the Stug 3 on the Eastern Front, especially when it was given the longer gun, the longer 75. So the fact that you're taking a German idea which was successful and trying to make your own makes complete sense. And with this said, because of this, the vehicle was based off an improved chassis of the M1441, which was the M1542, so it had an even better chassis, and it would be equipped with a 75mm anti-tank gun which would break from existing Doctrine. What you've got to remember is, if we go back to the Doctrine in 1938, they wanted these machines to be artillery pieces as well as tank destroyers as well as everything else. Well, the 7534, you can definitely say, was much more geared towards putting big holes in big tanks. The artillery side of things is a lot lessened with this vehicle compared to others that we have seen. The gun itself was a 75mm L34 Breda gun, and it was a version of a field gun plastered with a longer barrel. And it also had an 8mm Breda on the roof pintle mount, so once again could be removed quite easily. It used AP and HE shells with a muzzle velocity of 624 meters per second, so nothing to write home about with the muzzle velocity, but I thought it was quite nice that you have quite a large gun, has access to AP and HE. Couldn't find actual values for the penetration on these, but I'm guessing something like, early short barrel 75, so the Germans may be slightly better than this. What is kind of nice though is that its armor was two 25mm plates on the front, which obviously equaled 50mm, and the side and rear were 25mm. So not a machine that is heavily armored, but could do well light fire. Also in 1943, they wanted to use the M43 chassis, which was a widened M42 one, but the production ran into delays, and training and manpower were also an issue, so actually being able to produce the tanks and crew them, and then training on top of that. This meant that the demise of the Semovente DAR 7534 was not exactly sweet, but after the armistice, 36 tanks were confiscated by the Germans, and they also ordered a second production run for this vehicle. Most vehicles which served in German service after the armistice, so this isn't something that's completely out of the blue. The majority of the vehicles that were left on the German side of the lines, they just took and used for themselves. So the interesting thing though is the name of this. So the name of it is the Sturmgeschütz M42 MIT 7534 851I, which I think is a great name, and also, it means that we could get some Italian premiums in the German tech tree, which would be, would be a little bit of fun. The last but not least vehicle that I'm going to cover today, and if you do want me to have a look at other vehicles, of course I will, just let me know, is the Semovente DAS 7546. So this is the self-propelled of the 7546 variety. There's 11 of them built. Some people believe there was 15 of them built. I'm personally just going to go with 11 because it's the number which is banded around a little bit more. And this is a 1943 vehicle. This was going to be one of the last Italian tanks to actually enter service. And it was based on the M42 medium tank chassis, and also used the Semovente DAR 7534. So the chassis that was used for the 7534 was the same as the one that was supposed to be used for the 7546. Though, the designer who designed this wanted to use an M42L chassis, which is a chassis which is a little bit lower and a little bit wider at the same time. But before even the project really got going, the armistice was signed, and therefore the plans themselves were halted. Now, because the factories that were looking to produce these Semoventes fell under German control, what was decided to do was the Germans would order to carry on production of these vehicles and anything else that was being created at the time. So the designed machine had an M1542 chassis with the Modelo 34L46 anti-aircraft gun, which they were struggling to actually find. The supply of these guns was not the best. So the 7546 CA Modelo 34 with a HE shell of around 6.5 kilos. On top of this, what is also interesting is that it had a negative 12 gun depression and plus 22 inside the casemate. So negative 12 gun depression is nothing to scoff at. For me, I think that's a pretty decent number to have. The chassis was lower and wider than the previous one, so this basically confirms that it was an M42L, and it was also, because it was lower, because it was wider, there was more space for the crew, and also it had a more sloped front of it, which is something that the Germans really wanted. Front armor thickness was 75 to 100 millimeters thick, so decent compared to what else we've seen from these Italian vehicles. The side itself was 42 to 60 millimeters, so 60 in the best places, and the rear was 25 to 35 millimeters. It also had itself an SPA 15TB M15 diesel 3601, 192 horsepower, 15 horsepower per ton. And of course, this machine was 15.8 tons. Overall, these are 5 machines which I think we will definitely get when the Italian ground forces come out. Because I know a lot of people have been talking about the Italians are limited in what vehicles they can have. Well, that just makes it really, really easy to work out which vehicles are going to be in the tech tree. I hope that I've made the case here for these 5 vehicles. If you want me to have a look at other vehicles, or if you want to have a look at my notes or anything like that, I'm going to post it all up on the Discord just to show how much different this is compared to the majority of other stuff that I do. Anyway, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.